Hello! So, my article today is by Albert E. Stone. It's Identity and Art in Frederick Douglass's Narrative. If you keep looking down, it's because where my notes are. So, basically, Stone's talking about how Douglass doesn't only escape slavery physically, but he's also reclaiming his identity. And he talks about how this is a really unique approach to a freedom narrative because he's kind of being more soulful, kind of, being more honest and more authentic with it. He's not, focusing solely on the physical. He doesn't shy away from giving the gory details of the horrors of slavery, but he also talks about, kind of shows how that hurts someone's mind as well. So Stone opens by providing background information about the genre of slave and freedom narratives. I thought it was really interesting that this genre was the first genre of autobiographies to be widely read in America. So even with the horrible institution of slavery, African Americans were still had the first autobiographies that were widely read in America. I thought that was a really I thought that was really interesting. And Stone really emphasizes Douglass's honesty, and he does this, he compares him actually to Harriet Jacobs, and she dramatizes the experience of slavery, he says, with fictional names and fictional dialogue, and he says, sentimental language and melodramatic plot of fear, seduction, and flight. He says that Harriet Jacobs is trying to appeal to the romance genre and people's interest in romance and trying to, get their attention that way, but Douglass is very honest and he doesn't add emotion or take away emotion. He doesn't add to or take away anything from his story. He's just telling the truth. And of course Harriet Jacobs was also telling the truth, but she was taking a different approach than Douglass took. He also, one of the things that I did disagree with was he references several articles and he talks about how they don't do justice to the narrative, which I would agree that's probably true, but he says it as though they should be able to take every meaningful thing out of the text, and I'm not sure that that's possible, to find every meaningful piece of evidence from an article, or from a narrative, but I do see what he's saying. I just think it's kind of a very high goal. And then he does, throughout the article, he makes this really interesting observation about the kind of metaphors that Douglass uses. He often talks about ships and shipbuilding and sailing and things like that. He talks about how these metaphors really correspond with different parts of Douglass's life. He says that when he's a child, that first half of his life on the plantation, he references shipbuilding like he's growing into a man, like he's being built. And then later on, he always associates ships with freedom. So when he's sailing to Baltimore and he's in the bottom of that boat, and that's very symbolic to his life. And towards the end of his life, this wasn't in the excerpt that we read, but how Douglass escapes is he kind of disguises himself as a sailor, and that's how he escapes. So this metaphor of, the ship and the sea is seen throughout his life, and it always corresponds with that part of his life, and he uses it over and over again in this book. And along with that, he also uses a metaphor of the gate, and Stone talks about the symmetry of Douglas's narrative, which I think Stone talks about how this is genius on Douglas's part to really include so much artistic kind of pieces in his work, but also I think that's so interesting because he also talks about that this is just Douglas's life, and so Douglas is just telling the truth here. But for me, with a Christian perspective, I think it's so interesting that Douglas really is just telling the story of his life, and not only has Douglas noticed that symmetry and put it in there, but that symmetry was placed in his life by God. God planned his life, and I found that so interesting and especially so comforting right now. But that God orchestrated all of this, and he used those horrible things for Douglas's good. But Stone also compares Douglas to other authors often, and I found that very interesting. I really wish that Stone would have kind of dug into that a little more, because he compares him to Benjamin Franklin more than once, and he doesn't really, he just says this is similar to Benjamin Franklin, and he doesn't really say how. So I thought that was really interesting, but I really wish he would have dug into it more so I could understand it better. I'm sure if I were more familiar with those authors, it would make more sense. But and then he also talks about how, again with the symmetry of Douglas's life and story, he talks about how different portions of Douglas's life kind of juxtapose or correlate with other parts of his life. So he considers Douglas to have, like two lives. He has the first half of his life before his fight with Covey, and the second half of his life after his fight with Covey. But he talks about, speaking of his childish sufferings, he remarks, "I had no bed, I must have perished with cold, but that the coldest nights I used to steal a bag which was used for carrying corn to the mill." And of course we read this portion, he's talking about how his feet would crack from the cold and how painful and horrible that was. But he doesn't finish the comparison. I'm thinking maybe he might be talking about the contrast between him having no bed on the plantation and then moving to Baltimore and still being a slave but having a bed. I'm not really sure where he was trying to go with that. But, and he also talks about when Douglas is talking about how he was so surprised by in the North people would say, "Oh, slaves must be happy because they sing all the time." And Douglas was, wanting to correct that, saying, "No, we sing to comfort ourselves because we're in pain, and we sing to kind of mourn ourselves, mourn our lives, and that it was out of sorrow that they sing." And he doesn't really talk about what he's comparing that to or what that juxtaposes, but I think it would have been really interesting if he had taken that and compared it to when Covey makes him sing on Sundays. And I thought that would have been a really interesting comparison if he had taken it farther. But so I thought he had really interesting observations. I just wish he would have gone a little farther with them. I also thought it was really interesting that Stone considers Douglas to have three identities. So he talks about, I'll read the excerpt. He says, he's talking about how Douglas is reclaiming his identity, and he has this sense of self throughout his life, even though his circumstances change. And he says, this same sense of himself as two persons, yet one self, is likewise expressed in Douglas's various names and aliases. Though at different times he becomes Bailey, Johnson, and Douglas, he never relinquishes Frederick. "I must hold on to that to preserve a sense of identity," he declares near the close of his narrative. So we didn't read that portion when he talks about he has to hold on to his first name as his sense of self, but he really, I don't remember really discussing any of his name changes in the portion that we read, but I thought that was really interesting that he always keeps his first name even though his last name changes, that, you know, life may take him to different parts and different places, different circumstances. They may be good or they may be bad, but he always has Frederick. He always has that piece of himself that is solely himself, no matter where he is or what's happening to him. And towards the end of the article, it kind of becomes more unclear to me. I'm not really sure where he was going or what his point really was, but he was talking about more of Douglas's argumentation, and he says that he writes that Douglas wrote 3 total versions of his autobiography, the narrative and life being the first one, and then he wrote 2 more. And he was kind of saying that each version had a different kind of like approach, and that he was very adamant that the narrative that we read, the narrative and life of Frederick Douglass, was the best, and that the other ones could not hope to be as good. And then he kind of, earlier in the article, he talks about how, you know, when Douglas wrote the narrative and the life, he was very young. He was, you know, in the section that we read, he tells us that he's between 27 and 28, and Stone says that, you know, he may have better memory because he was writing at a younger age, and I don't know if that's what he was relating to when he was saying that the other narratives could not hope to be as good, because he's older, and I think from what I read about them in this article, it sounded like the other narratives kind of focused, like, one on the psychological effects of the trauma that he went through, and the other was more of like the physical effects or more of a political stance. I'm not really positive, but it's kind of the sense that I got, and that, you know, because of that, the narrative that we read would be the best of them because it incorporated every part of the human. It incorporated both his mind and his body, and really kept them together, and how they work with each other. And then at the end, what makes me think that he might be referring to earlier in the article when he talks about Douglas being young when he wrote his narrative, that because his second to last sentence is excuse me, this is not the second to last sentence, but he talks about that the most compelling Black autobiographies have been the work of the young, and I'm not really sure what significance he was drawing from that. He didn't really explain it, so I don't know what he was talking about, but he gave several examples of autobiographies that were written when the author was young. Again, I think he might be referring back to their memory is better, but he doesn't really clarify what his what significance he's drawing there. But he does close with high praise of the narrative, saying that it is the groundwork for civil rights leaders to really stand up and give their stories. So that's what I found from the article. I thought it was a very interesting read. The questions I have for you are, of course, on your handout. It says, in what ways do you think Douglas's narrative takes a different approach than Harriet Jacobs? What about his approach do you think made it so effective? So, Stone does compare Douglas to Harriet Jacobs, like I mentioned earlier, and I thought that was really interesting because we also read Harriet Jacobs, so I was just wondering, I was interested to see what you guys thought about the two of them and comparing the two of them, because both of them were very emotional, but like Stone says, I think Jacobs' narrative was more intentionally emotional. And of course she goes through very personally traumatic things, and Douglas does as well, but a different kind of personal. personal trauma. And then the next question was, why do you think Douglas used metaphors of ships and seas so often? And do you think this was a conscious decision? So I think we can make a lot of really interesting points and not even realize that we're making them. So I was just curious whether or not you thought this was a conscious decision, because sometimes they're conscious and sometimes they're not. And either way, they have their own significance. But I also thought it was really interesting that he's so consistent with the ships and seas. So that's another reason why I was wondering if this was a conscious decision, because if it was conscious, it would make sense that that was so consistent. But if it wasn't, that would be really interesting, just that that is so ingrained in his mind that he keeps repeating it. And then my final question, Douglas describes abolitionist literature as both giving him hope and causing a deep depression within him. Other than bringing awareness to the potential of being free, how do you think this experience may have shaped his identity? You know, of course we're all English majors or literature minors, and we all have a deep love for literature, and we know that it can change you and really affect your life. And of course Douglas has that moment with the dialogue between the slave and the owner that he found in that I think it was a newspaper that he found, and that really was a life-changing moment for him when he found that. But besides, you know, realizing that he has the potential to be a free man someday, how else do you think that could have shaped his identity? Yeah, Douglas is one of my favorite historical figures. One of my favorite quotes from him is, "Once you learn to read, you will forever be free." And the English person in me just loves that. But I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did, and thank you so much.